Good morning and welcome to TVP World Talks, where every word matters. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. As tensions between the United States and China rise, both countries are stepping up their economic moves. Now, recently, China announced new tariffs on U.S. imports, and with its growing global trade influence and efforts to reduce its reliance on imports, the question becomes the following: how much can Beijing actually withstand if this trade war drags on, especially if the U.S. moves forward with even higher tariffs? Now, joining me now to discuss what's really at stake here is Ignacy Morawski, Chief Economist at Puls Biznesu. Welcome to the program.
Hello, good morning.
So let's begin with the latest. I mean, this trade relationship between the U.S. and China has really been seen intensifying. I mean, we just saw that Trump is in no rush to speak to Xi Jinping. What do you think is Beijing's strategy in this entire situation that it has just slapped back at the United States?
Well, I think that first of all, the situation is not new. The conflict or tension between China and the U.S. has been growing for the last 10 years. And there is no big difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of approach to China. There is a broad consensus in Washington that U.S. economy should be to some extent decoupled from China or made less dependent on Chinese supplies. So this is the continuation of the conflict that started 10 years ago and continued during Biden administration, and now is continuing during Trump administration. So, well, China probably will try to go some middle way, not engage in some hot trade war, because China is very dependent on exports. Chinese economy is much more dependent on exports in general than U.S. economy. So China has to protect global trade and freedom of movement of goods. Therefore, I wouldn't expect China to be the major mover in this war. It will react, obviously, to what U.S. will do, but it is in great interest of Chinese economy to protect free trade, at least at this moment. Moreover, probably, as most countries around the world, China will try to redirect its exports from U.S. to other destinations in Asia, in Europe. Only around 15% of Chinese exports goes directly to United States. That share is probably higher if we include indirect routes, but still, it is possible to redirect.
Do you think that it's really going to last this long? It's really going to become some kind of permanent trade war?
Yes, more or less, yes. I think we are in a new era, protectionist era, and many countries will try to protect their markets. So I think in general we will have more regulations imposed on trade, more tariffs. Although I hope and suppose that in the end tariffs will be lower on average than those imposed last weekend on Mexico and Canada, and maybe even lower on average than imposed on China.
Which is halting for 30 days. I mean, as of
yes, at this moment, but we will not. We don't know what will happen. So some kind of trade restrictions will be imposed. Some kind of tariffs will appear.
What about LNG here? I mean, the liquefied natural gas exports project. I mean, isn't this going to be like a huge hit for the U.S.?
No, well, not huge. Certainly not huge. For some companies, maybe, but there will be a big demand for gas in Europe because Europe wants to decrease energy prices, and one of the key elements in this strategy is decreasing the price of fuel. So gas is an important fuel for general electricity prices, and if Europe wants to have lower electricity prices, it needs to buy more gas at lower prices from United States. So I think that U.S. will find markets for its gas, and it will not hit severely, certainly not severely, the U.S. economy.
But what about, I mean, if we talk from both sides about businesses and consumers, how is it going to impact? I mean, what can they be, how can they be reacting to this? I mean, if we put the government aside, I mean, to both these tariffs going on, this tariff war on each other?
You mean consumers in businesses and consumers in U.S.?
At each other, in the U.S. and China together. How do you see that?
Well, I think that large businesses do not want to see a big trade war.
Particularly those, for example, in the U.S., I mean, that rely heavily, right, on Chinese.
I think on both sides. And when Trump decided on weekend to impose high tariffs on those three countries, several large American companies lost on the stock market. And one of them was Tesla, which belongs to Elon Musk, the key business ally of Donald Trump. So you can see that big business doesn't like tariffs because tariffs distort global supply chains and make production more difficult and more expensive. So I suppose that there will be some kind of a backlash among big producers in the United States against tariffs. But this backlash will not be strong enough to prevent some kind of tariffs to be imposed in the end.
So let me ask you this, but do you essentially think that can China actually and the United States essentially avoid a full-on trade war? Is one side, do you think, going to become stronger?
Well, it depends on what we mean for full trade war. The trade war, as I said, started 10 years ago. And the United States tries to decouple from Chinese economy, so to decrease dependence on Chinese supplies, and this will continue. Certainly, this will continue. The approach in Washington to China is, I would say, negative. They want to see a decreased amount of trade between those countries. Or at least decreased share of China in U.S. trade, and they want to see less dependence on key supplies of resources. So I suppose that the tension between China and U.S. will last. This is a long-term factor. The key question here is whether the tension will become I would say a hot war in the end or not. Let's hope they can solve those issues, and we can see some positive signs that Donald Trump wants to engage in dialogue with China. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, he allowed TikTok, the Chinese company, to work longer in U.S. So he made some, I would say, reconciliatory moves towards Beijing.
What about this U.S. and China tariff war and its impact on our continent here in Europe?
Well, trade wars generally affect economy negatively in the short term. So we will see probably lower economic growth and especially lower industrial production growth. However, I would not expect the impact to be severe and long-lasting. So supply chains will adjust in the end. Probably countries will need to increase their domestic production. So in general, each of the big economic blocs, European Union, United States, and China, will be less interdependent on each other. Each of them will grow its own domestic production capacity. So what we will see in the European Union is more industrial policy, more support for local production, especially in the areas related to technologies, mm-hmm. like digital technologies, AI, but also automotive technologies, machine technologies. So all those areas in which Europe was and has been always strong, we will see more support for domestic production. And this, to some extent, will cushion the impact of trade war in the long term. So unless trade war is very severe, like it's a spiral, unless it is a spiral in which both sides increase tariffs step by step, I think the impact on European economy would be negative but limited in the short term and very limited in the long term.
Threats of U.S. tariffs may be a political rhetoric rather than an actual threat. This is what Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk had told journalists. He said that the European Union would act together and would be ready to respond to any U.S. action within an hour if deemed necessary. What do you think those kind of actions would entail exactly if it were to get to that situation?
We will see. I don't know. From what we hear, I can understand that EU will impose its own tariffs on U.S. goods if United States acts like it did against Mexico and Canada or against China. Mm-hmm. So if Washington imposes new tariffs, new limits on imports from European Union, the EU will do the same. But the key question here is whether the EU should respond in such a way. I think there are different interests in the European Union. There are some countries which are more exposed to the trade war, like Germany.
If they should, so you're saying that they shouldn't?
I'm not certain.
I mean, Ursula von der Leyen also.
I'm not certain. I think the EU should be reluctant to respond by one-to-one to U.S. tariffs. Well, most simulations demonstrate, economic simulations, that if the trade war becomes a spiral, like one side moves and the other side responds, and the first side responds again, it will be more harmful for the economy than if only one side imposes tariffs. That's one factor here. The second factor is that, to some extent, Donald Trump is right when he criticizes European Union for maintaining too large trade balance against United States. I think the EU should increase imports from the US. EU should increase domestic demand. EU should promote domestic demand, especially investments. And if the European Union invests more, in general, if we have large investments, like, for example, Mario Draghi postulated in his famous report, then naturally trade balance between the European Union and United States will improve. Europe will have more imports from the US, and Washington and Donald Trump will be happy. So I think that to some extent the EU should look at itself in the first, I would say, step, right? And then the third important factor is that the impact of tariffs on various countries will be different. So probably Germany will be the country which is the most impacted, and tariffs are mostly harmful for German industry. But when it comes to other countries like Poland, the impact will not be as large. So I don't think that Europe should maintain an assertive stance towards Washington in this conflict.
We'll see how that definitely plays out. Thank you so much, Ignacy Morawski, for being with us here today on World Talks. And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.